Hello, everybody. Welcome today to a very special guest, Daniel Sigg. Hello, Daniel.
Hi.
Hi. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're joining us from this evening?
I join you from St. Paul, Minnesota. So we are located in the Midwest of the United States, so northern United States. The city St. Paul is actually very close to Minneapolis. So it's really Minneapolis, St. Paul, and we sometimes call it the Twin Cities. I am originally actually from Switzerland, though, but I've been living here for a longer time now.
Do you think that your Swiss background in any way impacts the photographs you take?
Yeah, I do think so. I do think so. I mean, maybe my upbringing, I grew up in Switzerland, and so you know, um, even with my younger adult years, I spent in Switzerland as well. So I think I was culturally clearly influenced from there initially. Yeah, yeah, I'd say
It's
so.
interesting for us to look at your work. As you know, the project I'm doing with students in school is about architecture. When
Yeah,
I think of Switzerland, I think of uh, very low-lying buildings and
yeah,
very high mountains, obviously.
yes.
Uh, do you think that buildings in your architectural work become like mountains?
Yeah, I haven't thought about it that way. That's a very interesting observation. Yeah, and when we look at the first picture you show here, it may be, yeah, it could be.
Mm.
Um,
Where did you actually take
yeah,
this?
I've never thought about it that way.
Where did you take this photograph? Because this obviously isn't.
This is in Minneapolis, actually. Yeah, so typically my architecture photography, there are architecture photographs for photographers who I think they go about it highly technical, and they're on a tripod, and you know they might even use special lenses, so-called tilt shift lenses,
Mm.
to get the line straight and so forth. And I typically don't do that. I just I walk around, could be in downtown Minneapolis, which this one is, and have my camera with me, and yeah, and just look for subjects and things that interest me.
I
So
really enjoyed reading about your take on minimalism. That minimalism, for a lot of uh, the viewers, will be very much about a philosophy that's rooted also in visual arts. You took it one step further, and we're talking about minimalism in terms of actually even the kit you use, that you pare back.
yeah,
You enter a state of voluntary poverty with your actual.
yeah. I
Um,
don't know if it's poverty. My cameras are still, they're not the cheapest, but having said that, there's something to be said about simplifying your kit or your gear. I think as photographers, and I don't do it professionally anymore. I used to do it for a few years also professionally. So, this will be more product photography and other things. But even for my personal work, I think photographers tend to worry about gear a little too much sometimes, and tend to bring all these different lenses and things like that. And I think sometimes it's just good to go out with one camera and one lens, and or it could be your iPhone too, frankly, or a mobile phone,
yeah.
and just kind of look for the subjects, look for the light, look for the moment, depending on what you're photographing. And I think that's, yeah.
Would
Yeah, I'm
you
glad
agree that
thanks for reading.
the kit doesn't make the photographer?
Sorry, say that again.
Would you agree that the kit doesn't make the photographer?
It doesn't meet him.
It doesn't make him. So
Oh, it doesn't make. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's interesting. I did actually. So you alluded to my blog, and I did actually. That's something I tend to think about still quite a bit. The whole issue around your tool or your kit, right? I do think, yes, I would definitely agree with you that the tool or the camera doesn't make the photographer at all. It's a little cliche to say it's what's behind the camera, but because I would say in some ways you're seeing through your camera, right? So you have to start learning what your camera sees, but it's still, you're telling the camera what to see. Does that make sense? So, so I think that that's a little bit how, you know, that takes a lot, that takes a little while. And I'm not saying I mastered it, but that's kind of how I think about it. And so but I do think there's an important aspect to the gear, in that I think you have to enjoy it. You have to enjoy the camera you're using.
Mm.
You know, I like cameras that are relatively simple, straightforward. That's also why I like film photography. I don't know if my video is showing, but I could show it to you. But, you know, like an example of a simple camera. But basically, a simple film camera, all you're adjusting, you know, is your focus, your shutter speed, and your aperture. And that's kind of it.
Yeah.
You know, that's basically all I'm worrying about to
Can
some
I just
extent.
draw
And then of
every-
course it's your framing, so you really can focus in on the subject matter.
I would like everybody, if you are watching this and you're one of my students, please do go onto Daniel's website. It has got so many different aspects to it. Not only does it have the portfolio of many different types of work, photographic work, but it's also got links to podcasts, to blog, a mine of information for people interested in photographs and photography. And in the introduction below this video on YouTube, I will also put the link to the site so you can follow that and have a really thorough investigation. I did mention the mountains already. I think when I look at these, you know, I deliberately put them together.
Mm-hmm.
To me, there are so many commonalities. It's not just the sort of the shape, the jaggedness, but obviously something about the depth of tone and an appreciation of distance, maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting. That is also a fairly simple, this is in a way a very simple composition, but I personally also like what you mentioned, is kind of, you see you still see a little bit of a layering. It's not you know, the traditional modern landscape photography does a lot of, we call it near far. So you're having an object really close to the foreground, and then with a really wide, usually photographers use very wide angle lenses, and then, you know, so you really have this foreground interest, and then, you know, the rest is then you have some middle ground and some background. So typical image composition. Now we do have that a little bit here, but the foreground is actually really not close to us. I mean, I would say that's, you know, even from where I think where I was standing there was probably, that's at least 200, 300 meters away. So we're, you know, this is I think a 50 millimeter lens.
Mm.
So, but
I'm just
yeah.
wondering about somebody like you who, you know, we are approaching your work as photographers of architectural forms. But I still think that this image and images like it by you are a very good kind of give us good direction, even as architectural photographers. Um, could you say a little bit about that? So if we were going to go into a cityscape, or even just in our towns or villages, and photograph buildings immediately surrounding us, without being concerned with landscape proper like this,
Mhm.
how could a landscape image such as this one still inform our architectural photography?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I like, when you look at this image, maybe as an example, I do like a sort of symmetry usually in my images. It's not a perfect one, but for example, here I see like a triangle on the left, I see one to the right, and then I kind of see that mountaintop in the back. So it's kind of, you know, and then, so that's one. I often, you know, another thing maybe that I generally do that, you know, might help in architectural photography and in and landscape is kind of looking at your lines and your, what we call the composition. So I don't know if this is a perfect example for this, but I certainly was somewhat deliberate on how I placed the upper right. So that line from the mountain in between, if you will, goes to the upper right. So we have a little bit of a, the corner.
Yep.
So I always try to pay a little bit attention to what's in the corner or what's not in the corner.
To me, it looks like a perfect paper cut.
Yeah.
Like gates of space that open out to reveal
Yeah. Yeah.
this idea of
Yeah.
layers again. It also reminds me, of course, of Ansel Adams and very much about like zoning for tone. And
Yeah.
lots of my students will know about this already, this idea that, you've got graduated tonal quality, almost like
Yeah.
weighted tones
Yeah.
that also have a relationship with sometimes distance.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly right. And this is actually nice. So we did have a little, there must have been a little bit of a haze in the sky that gives us that additional depth to the image.
I'm just going to go back to the first one though,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
because there are still the same sense of almost like zoning, I think,
Mm-hmm.
because of the way the shadow falls on that central building,
Yeah.
both on the completely dark face, but also on the illuminated side, where we have the cast shadow of the other building as well. We have recessions of space. When you're looking up to take these photographs, are you um, engaged with the shadow, or are you only looking at the shape, or is the shadow a shape in itself?
Yeah, so I did notice the shadow when I was taking this photograph, and I did later on. This was actually so I would say the majority is what's interesting about this one. The majority of my architecture work is film, so it's film emulsion. This is actually a digital. Now, not that it matters that much, but it may. But it does. I did like. I think one thing that I don't edit my images too much, but I did create. I like that shadow a little darker on the right hand side. So I mean, you could make it visible, but I do like that it goes from, kind of a deep black almost to the almost white in the clouds. Yeah,
We
and
spend a
then
lot
it
of
has
time
this.
altering things like black point,
Yeah,
which for us, even in very rudimentary software, in fact, actually, we do a lot of editing even in PowerPoint,
yeah.
because not everybody at home has access to Lightroom, Photoshop.
Yeah, Lightroom or yes,
Uh,
and right. So the black point, you can, there are different, and you may have discussed that with your students already, but there are different ways of adjusting that. As you mentioned, adjusting the black point. Another one that's commonly used, we call it levels. It's kind of similar to what she said. I mean, you kind of do that in the levels settings. So you can actually do the same for the black point and the white point. And so that's part of the level. Or we can just overall change the contrast with what we call the curves. So we can create contrast curves and be a little more, it's a little different, but there's some overlap. It gets a little bit confusing. And people even use levels and levels and curves on top of each other in Photoshop in layers. So there's all kinds of things we can do. Now, this one is a digital image, and I started out as a color image actually.
mm-hmm.
But I already I do like to your question, with the patterns and so forth. I think the architecture, I like design and kind of patterns and textures. And so for that, I think black and white lends itself to that. It doesn't have to be, but I just like it.
On your site, it's very interesting to see that you do have photographs in black and white and then some crossover with images that are doubles but in color, or very
Yeah.
similar images that have maybe
Yeah.
been shot at the same time. Um, I'm interested to know, when you say you're working in film,
Hmm.
and for example, you shot this on film, are you then
Yep.
using a negative scanner?
Yeah. So my process in film. So I photograph in 35 millimeter and medium format film, also known as 120 film. And the 35 millimeter is the standard, what we call full frame format. And this is a 35 millimeter. And so that was a black and white film. And then, yeah, I develop it. So black and white I do at home, I do myself. And then I scan it with a DSLR. So I do scan it with a camera. So I have a little setup, and where the negative is illuminated from the back or from below, and then I have a lens that's on a tripod, so to say, and then photograph those each negative with the DSLR camera, and then it needs to be brought into Lightroom. So it's interesting. So people refer to that as a hybrid process, because the pure analog process would mean I would have to go into the dark room, which I don't have a dark room. But I do develop the negatives, the black and whites. The color negatives I usually bring to the lab. We have a local lab, and so I just bring them because it's a little bit different chemicals, and they don't. It's a storage issue. Black and white is pretty simple,
Yeah.
and I would say for any young photographer who's interested, I would highly recommend at least trying it sometime with film, because I think it's
We're very
not
lucky at school, because when we're actually in school, of course, we're not at
oh,
the moment, but we do have a dark room.
okay, nice.
And
Okay,
I think we've only managed to be in it once,
okay.
since the students that and the architecture project, that project, and that's the group of students, they've only had quite limited time
Oh,
in
sure,
school.
sure.
So that's
Yeah,
something for us to look forward to, very much so. I think, this magic, isn't it? The magic of processing for me isn't magical. Processing is extremely stressful, but the developing of a print is
yeah.
magical.
Oh, yeah.
Alchemy.
For me, even I'm excited when I do my one of the things with film, and maybe that's also for me personally, it's a it's a little bit delayed gratification, because until you develop, you don't know what you have. You hope that all the shots you've taken are, hopefully decent and in focus or whatever the intent was, but yeah, it is nice so there's kind of that delay, but I always look forward to, once I develop my negatives, even to just look at the negatives the first time. That is also a little magical to me. Just to see them, and hopefully they look good, and so you get a little bit of an idea what you have then, just by.
One of the questions that my students asked,
Yep.
was about how many photographs you take actually to end up with one excellent image that you then share with us, your audience.
It really depends, that's a great question. I think it's also a little bit dependent on the medium. With film, I tend to be maybe even more restrained in how many pictures I take, because you know that every picture you take, I mean, there's a little bit of a cost associated. Of course, that is true with digital cameras as well, and eventually you have to replace your digital camera bodies every so often. So I don't want to go into the whole cost argument, but it tends to be that with film, that ratio is probably a little lower. But I would say with each roll I shoot on a 36 or even a medium format, I always have some that hopefully are that I'm fairly happy with. But that I but it's a great question. I don't know that I have a great ratio for that. With digital, I think what happens sometimes is we tend to, or at least I tend to photograph more, because you just can.
Mhm.
And but that's not always a good thing. So I think I like that about film. It forces you to kind of slow it down a little bit.
Is that
And
another element to your minimalist philosophy?
yeah, a little bit. Maybe it can be. Yes, I think so. And right, right.
So, I mean, speaking of minimalism,
Yeah.
uh, these photographs I put on here, even if I wasn't doing a project on architecture and speaking to you on behalf of my students, this is a slide just for me, really, because I think these photographs are so profoundly beautiful.
Oh, thank you. That's so kind of you to say.
Well, I do, and I think they are deeply sort of special. I can't quite get any purchase on them. I understand them as landscape.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
and I can tell you a little. So this is s- I so so they are clearly minimalists that and I can give you a little bit of background on them. So first of all, they were taken in northern Minnesota. This is the Lake Superior. So we are literally looking at the frozen lake in front of us. So the white layers all the way to, where it starts to get more blue is basically frozen lake. And then in the next layer, so then it starts to almost look like we have that line of, it's hard to say, but it's very cold. So we may have a little bit of what we call sea smoke. So when it gets really cold, we see a little bit of that. And then we just have a layer of clouds that, and the kind of a gradient in the sky. And yeah, so they're obviously all taken at the same, there was a series of a few shots I took with a long lens, actually. So that was a telephoto lens. That is often and that might be something also for architecture if you want to tie it back to that.
mm,
Sometimes using a longer lens is actually nice to just get more, to minimize,
mm.
because the wider your lens, of course, the more is included in your frame. And so
What
this is
prompted your choice to make them such sliver-like forms?
um, yeah, that's a good question. I think so we were, so I was on the shore. It was obviously very cold, and it was already, as you can tell from the right image, has the sun kind of coming through the clouds. And I think it was just something I kind of just liked that. um, I guess I saw a little bit of that. I just loved those layers, and the simplicity of it. And there are a lot. So once you have, I, I still, I love architecture. I definitely still love landscape photography. And I think that was just something where there are a lot of interesting subjects, but that was kind of yeah, it was really a nice scene
What I
that
think is
caught my
really
eye.
interesting is that there are still commonalities between this, and this, to do with a sense of layer and depth of space that somehow, well, obviously to all of us thinking about composition, space is very important, but that there's also a kind of elemental space, a kind of quietness.
Hmm.
Even the jagged edges of architecture that will belong to a busy city becomes very quiet.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's true. And it is very interesting. The Lake Superior it's kind of it is a special place too, which is it sounds a little bit strange perhaps, but it's quite unique. The lake itself, it's called a lake, but we don't see the other side. In fact, it looks like an ocean. So it's a pretty amazing, very, very big, one of the biggest lakes, I think, and certainly in the US, even the world. But so yeah, it's quite a very interesting place. And in the winter, it obviously does get very cold. So,
And then we go from this, you know, incredibly serene place, and I'm talking about quietness across the first
yeah,
three
then we go a little bit
slides. And then
into
we
the
come
street.
into, you know, basically the visual representation of any kind of Miles Davis, kind of smoky jazz, somehow timeless yet belonging to very much 20th century conventions of color photography. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this work?
Sure. Yeah. So another area that I've been interested in and working in is the street photography, or what, which is a broad term for, just photographing out on the streets. Now, in the broadest sense, I would say I would even include my architecture work into street, but it's not, it just doesn't have typically people in it. Most of the times it doesn't. And the architecture work was actually, some of it was actually done also during we have lockdown too, but it was a little more limited in that we could still go out on the streets, but not go inside anywhere. So the streets were actually quite empty, and still are, even in our relatively big city. So the Minneapolis, St. Paul is about 3 million people, so it's not a small city. Yeah, and you're right. Yeah, it's just an area. Street photography is different in that it's challenging in a way that. Yeah, sometimes you have to move relatively fast, and yeah, and you just don't know what you get basically. But you mentioned, I think you mentioned before our when we just before this, we started recording, Saul Leiter and other influences, and so certainly I love the color photography of the 50s and 60s. Some of those photographers like Saul Leiter, Ernst Haas, and others that I really love. Some of that work is actually digital, and some of it is film. I tend to still use both mediums. Not that, again, I don't want to overemphasize that. I don't think it matters that much, but it's just something. Even if you use digital, I try to make them look a little bit like film.
Mm-hmm.
So, give it a little bit of the feel of film and emulate that, because I just enjoy that, also the look of it. It's not exactly the same, but again, I try to not over edit the images, and so a lot of those are just what I saw.
So 3 or 4 of my students asked me to find out from you about your influences. You've mentioned Ernst Haas and of course Saul Leiter.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked already a little bit about Ansel Adams. When we were thinking about architecture, you actually cite some very important architects as having heavily influenced you in the visual choices you make. So on your blog, you mentioned Mies van der Rohe, and
Yeah.
who else would you like to chuck into
Yeah,
the
so
mix?
I think it's interesting. So certainly I'm not an expert in architecture, so I need to get that get that straight. But so I would even say photographically, most of my influence comes more from traditional, not other photographers, but I would say much more from art.
Mm.
So painters, and I would even go as far and say Monet. So Impressionism, I think is. I'm more aware of this now. I wasn't aware of it before, but I think that I feel now that I studied it a little bit more too, the Impressionism in particular, that I think that that's more of an influence. I always loved modern art, and with some of that, that could be even Mondrian and Matisse, and so artists like that I always enjoyed. Jasper Jones, you know, like so there are a lot of artists that on the modern side that I enjoy. And so I always like to go to art museums. And so that's for me always a very big inspiration. So that's one aspect. On the design side, so I always liked modern or classic modern design. So Bauhaus like design, I always very much enjoyed, still do. So
I often find that when I'm talking to people about their love of architecture, people become terribly apologetic about being fans of Brutalism, for example.
oh
Um,
yeah.
and yet, often for photographers, especially architectural photographers, things that are highly formalized
Yeah.
already have these really clearly defined visual rhythms are a joy to photograph. They make photographing at once exciting and also, I'm not going to say easy, but the
Yeah.
skeleton of one's greatness lies in the good architectural scaffold upon
Yeah.
which we can hang all of our images. It seems always so funny that people should apologize for liking modern architecture.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. No, I agree. And right. Yeah, so that's, I mean, I certainly, Corbusier, I like, definitely I enjoy, yeah, and some of the more modern, the Swiss have some, there's some controversial modern architecture as well in Switzerland, but I shouldn't say controversial, but Herzog and Demeron are very famous architects out of Switzerland, and Botta. And they, not, I only say controversial because not everybody likes that modern style. But
You,
anyway, yeah.
you do.
I
And
do.
and again, this is about coming back to being influenced
Yeah,
and
yeah,
having like a whole raft of reference
yeah, that's
in
true.
one's memory. I mean, this is still classed on your website. At least this is still your street
Yeah,
photography. Yet
yeah,
again,
that's still some of the street stuff. Yep.
and yet this is also very kind of architectural, highly formalized. Something again that my students picked out about your work is very much about the interplay between reflection and shadow.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a lot of them are very curious to know about how you make the selection both of angle at which to shoot, but then also the reflections that you capture. Like how do you manage that within your lens when you're looking? Like what are the kinds of reflections you hope to see, and what kind of intention is there for reflection?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a very good question. I so one thing that I want to say is that I when I look at a frame, I really try. I mean, if there's time, sometimes you don't have that much time, but when I look at a frame and I see the reflections is something I got very aware of doing product photography, because reflections can be a problem
Mm.
as well. And one of the things in photography, or generally speaking, everything kind of reflects everything else in a way. So even things that are not highly, sometimes people call it efficient, that having a very polished surface or like glass or metal, a piece of metal, we still, if I hold a white paper close to another object, you will see that other object reflect the white paper. So there's that interplay, and I'm acutely aware of that, I think. Maybe part of why, because I worked on this so much. But so when I look at a frame, I really try to see the frame, really everything, including the reflections. Now, I'm not saying, this is makes it better or not better, but I'm certainly very much aware of what's in the frame, or if there's something, also something that bothers me in a frame sometimes, something I don't want to, and often this can be reflections, but you can of course use the reflections in your advantage, right? And like this image where I just, on the right, it's a simple it just kind of reflects a street scene, but you know, we see that it's a building, and it's still a detail that hopefully shows a little bit more. Now, the other one is the one on the left is actually taken in Switzerland, and I just noticed that lady on a break and just smoking, and it so happened that she was backlit, and I think I had a couple frames. That was film, so I captured just that moment where she exhaled from, and so yeah, and I created this one also. You know, that was one that I did, although it is film, I let it I did make a little bit of a stronger contrast, because I think I just wanted to emphasize especially that,
Mm.
you know, that the focal point is still that person, she's on her break and, you know, smoking her cigarette. And I wanted to make sure that it's really about that. And even though you don't see much detail, I think it is enough detail to see there.
Mm.
With the, you know, with the higher contrast, which sometimes when you do high contrast like that, we lose detail, but I don't think it, you know, again, I do it very deliberately when I do it, when I change something in an image.
I had a really lovely question from one of my students to ask you, and it was about your memory of photography. So, growing up, what are some of your earliest memories of photographs?
Oh, sure. Yeah. That's pretty easy for me because my dad was a documentary photographer, journalist, and so he always would photograph us. So my younger life with me and my brother is very well documented, which now is of course very nice.
Mm.
And so yeah, we've always seen him, you know, with the camera, it was, I think, a Minolta usually, taking, you know, film photographs. And so that was kind of my early memory. And then as I was kind of the age of your students, I was actually taking a darkroom class. And my parents bought me a book about photography that just had the history and some of the technical stuff. So it was just a nice little, you know, overview of photography back then. It was obviously not digital
Mm.
then, but that was kind of, those are kind of my main memories. And then they did buy me I had a Yashica SLR, it's a Yashica film camera.
Yeah.
So I started using it
Mm.
back
I'm
then.
interested also in the sense that if you've got lots of memories about photographs, that we build up a relationship with photography as really just part of life.
Hmm.
Um, I often say to my students it's of vital importance for us to study photography now more than ever before, because we are immersed in photographic images
Yep.
all the time. Do you perceive there to be a difference between photographs and photographs with a capital P?
Yeah, that's a that's a good question. You know, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if there's a difference. Well, you know, when I do, let's put it this way. So for my photography that, you know, we discussed today, you know, those are attempts that are, I would say, you know, deliberate attempts to, you know, to create something, hopefully, you know, with some more artistic value, or you know, for artistic purposes. But you know, there can be, of course, there are all these different genres of photography where you know, and so I don't want to judge like other photographs not being, you know, photographic. So I think, you know, we may document our daily life, for example, right? We may document our experience during lockdown, and I think all this is great.
But is there always an interchangeability with what we might otherwise consider to be art?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I can't. I'm not sure.
Mm.
Mhm.
I think also, we're constantly grappling with this question ourselves. Perhaps there isn't maybe an answer, or certainly not an answer that would ever be fixed.
Yeah.
Our answer has to move, change, and become fluid with what photographs are at any given moment, and also in the context of the history or indeed the sense of future they might have.
Right. Right. And that's a very good. Yeah. And that actually just reminds me of something. So I do a podcast, and I started that last in October, actually. It's a weekly podcast, and I really focus on the creative side of photography. So I think a lot about these types of questions, although I didn't have a good answer to your last question. But one, when this question of relevance of photography. So, for example, when we look at there was one photographer I interviewed. Her name is Nicole Struppert, and she's from Germany. And she did a lot of photography in London. Actually, I think she lived in London for 3 months out of the year for many, many years. And she photographed one of the areas, and I've unfortunately forgot the area. It was one of those areas, and we have many of those too in our city, that used to be more, an very artistic area that eventually became, a lot of high-end shops started to move in. And so we often call that gentrification. And so she was actually documenting that over the years. And she said, these photographs might not be, they're important to her right now. And right now, when other people see it, they might not think of it that much, but in 10 years or in 20 years, it could be really fantastic, especially if she has a body of work to show that a transformation of an area of London, I guess, over years. That's so. I mean, that's another way how to think about photographs and photographic projects. I often think of I think of it as often in a project setting, I guess, or projects are always a great thing to do in photography. It can be little things, can be like, yeah, it can be even do some architecture, in a certain neighborhood in your town or village or wherever you are. Architecture, of course, doesn't always mean high-rise buildings, right? It can be any.
I mean, it's a high yield project because anything built
Yes.
is available to us.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
kind of connected to what you were just saying about this idea that in the future, perhaps these photographs of London might become of kind of increased value somehow.
Yep.
One of my students wanted to know, when you're photographing buildings, do you photograph buildings that have a particular kind of cultural um, weight now? Do you go to buildings that are especially important now, or could it be any building that you photograph?
Um, that's a great question. So I think typically the answer would be I'm going more for the visual,
Mm.
uh, the visual things of photographs, and yeah. So not necessarily, yeah, of what's the history of the building. Now you could do that, and that could be a very interesting project as well, and focusing in on that. But yeah, I usually look for just certain things that interest me from a design standpoint, or patterns or lines, leading lines, and so forth. So that's kind of a
But I suppose we could find that in even the simplest brick building
Yep.
or barn. We could
Yeah,
find we
absolutely.
could find beauty in the corner of a windowsill. There's
Yeah,
so many shapes everywhere.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's especially maybe earlier photography, I certainly was always, I think that was one thing I was focused on, was photograph, capturing beauty and little things around us. And I think there can be, some people do macro photography. That's another way to, you can photograph some peanuts or coffee beans. I've done that too because I like coffee. But light them really, light them nicely, and you create perhaps an interesting composition and play with the composition and the lighting, and I can create beautiful images as well, just from little things like that.
So on the screen now,
Yep.
a very striking image created from extremely simple parts. Maddie, one of my students, wanted to know if these people if it was set up, or is it just as it happened?
Oh, this is not my image. I don't know where that is coming from, but that's not actually not one of my images.
It's attributed to you on quite a lot of
Really?
sites, yeah. So
Is it?
when we've been looking at this, though, I think this, even if it isn't one of yours, it does support this idea that even in the simplest of forms, we can
Yeah.
find something really beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is a great image, but unfortunately not mine, but yeah, it's a nice, obviously taking a very graphical approach, and having those two people. I don't know if it is staged or not. That's hard to say. It
Would
could
you
be.
say, I mean, it does lead me into a question, my bigger question that would have come from you saying, oh, yes, this is my photograph. But
Oh
now we still
yeah.
talk about the fact that actually, as I explained to you, the class who are doing the architecture project
Yep.
studied nature before. We were working with Keith Dotson in Tennessee, and also looking at Ansel Adams and a variety of other photographers, Bruce Peterson also for our studio work. I think sometimes photographing nature can feel terribly precarious because a drop of water or a gust of wind can change everything.
Yep.
And when photographing architecture, obviously the buildings are solid, they're not going to move about. But do you still think there's a sense of eternal change in every building?
I Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, I know what you mean, because it there may be that sense of something static that's not changing on the one hand, but I think even with, yeah, and it depends on how you depicting, right, that image, or how how you choose to frame it. And for example, even the lighting changes, like this image here, this first one, again, a different time of day, this may be all in shadow,
Yeah,
right? Or all in sun, and it could be interesting as well for other reasons, or the clouds are changing. It's interesting. One of the things I like to do, is to go back to some buildings. In the architecture, I've done that a few times. I photographed the same building several times, and I started looking at those images, and actually I even used the same lens, very similar framing, and I would even say similar times of the day, and they still are not the same.
yeah. Well, maybe
So,
this brings you back to your love of Monet.
yeah.
He returned to the cathedral
Yeah.
in all different weather conditions, painted it always from the same angle, but it was always completely different. And
Yeah.
I think that across all of your architectural photography, much as I don't necessarily know which buildings they are, but it's extraordinary to me how much you can get out of what really should be kind of like a dead object.
Yeah.
It's not, it's alive.
Right. And well, it's kind of you to say, and I think it's interesting. I think one of the things we haven't talked much about it, but maybe this particular image here wouldn't be the best example, but you can play a lot with perspectives. So especially a lot of my that architecture photography is kind of this looking up. So really looking up to tall buildings and
Yeah.
playing with the lines, and you can really start playing with perspective as well. I mean, even this image, I could have gone, for example, you can go much closer
Mm.
and then, start to create different geometries. And again, the point is just that you're really looking at what you have in your frame and see how that changes. So it's that there's a conscious element to that.
Mhm.
Um, that, yeah, that,
Yeah, I love the idea of proximity to the
mhm,
line, creating somehow a potential in that line. And I think for us as students, learning from you, that's going to be very useful to us. I mean, I know on this slideshow, I've actually really rather limited the what I would think of as pure architectural photography, because I know my students will be looking at that and
yeah,
and sticking those things in their sketchbooks as inspiration. But I think to consider how you lead us into an image is something, again, this idea of commonality. I mean, we're talking about lines and perspective at the moment, but again, we come back to what we talked about right at the beginning with
yeah,
layers of space, and that sense of moving into something that's actually quite I don't know, nebulous, or has a kind of no real end point,
mhm,
that we
yeah,
just vanish off into nothing in the distance. And even again, the simplest building could perhaps give that sense.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm. If you were going to advise us as photographers, like the key things as photographers of architecture that we ought to be exploring or studying, doing, looking out for, what would they be?
Mhm. That's a good question. You know, the first thing I'd say is just do it. You know, just do it and don't. Yeah, I said, with film, I'm a little more cautious, with a little more restrained with pressing the shutter, but that's really more a technicality. I would say don't think about that, and really experiment and play with what you see, and play with different angles, and that's probably the first thing. The other thing, one thing I tend to do, and that takes probably a little, as you're doing this more, is people talk about this, they call it visualization. Actually, Ansel Adams was the one person who coined that term, and I don't want to overstate that, but it's an important concept of trying to think about what your image will actually look like before you even press the shutter. And that doesn't mean you have to think about it a day ahead. It can be in the moment. Can be a very quick process. But I think as you're doing more of this, you will get a better feel for that, and kind of just having a vision of, that's what I want to accomplish. Kind of having a, um, you know, sometimes it may be, this is maybe not so true for for architecture. For street photography, sometimes street photographers, they may wait for, they may have a certain composition and may wait for something to happen in that frame. So that's of course a different technique that typically you don't do in architecture. But even in architecture, maybe you want to wait for the sun to come out behind that building, or that cloud to move over there, so that there might be little things, or that you might do night architecture photography, and you might look for certain, you know lights to come on or reflections to be created. So anyway, so all these things, So kind of that whole concept of visualization and thinking about, what you ultimately want to have in your frame.
Mm.
The other thing is, it's funny, like I had another photographer I interviewed, and I'm always very curious about the creative process of other people. That's in part why I do this podcast, and we're now at episode 16, actually. It just came out. So every week a new one comes out, and often there are interviews, but I also talk about lighting and other things. But so that one photographer interviewed, he's from New Zealand, and he said, just don't overthink it. So I am a thinker person, so I do think about it, but I think sometimes, as I said in the beginning, maybe just go out and just do it, and just, just make mistakes, and I still make mistakes, and sometimes things don't work out, and the composition may not work out, or we make an error, or things that, for example, we haven't talked much about this, but because it's more focused on architecture, so I now do some of my photographs where I have things on purpose out of focus, so create more of a impressionistic
Mm.
style, so to say, but I do that very deliberately with certain techniques and so forth. But again, that's that idea of, I have a certain image in mind that I want to hopefully can capture,
Mm.
and but then still let your intuition guide you. And as I'm walking around downtown or wherever I am, I'm just always kind of looking around and observing, and looking up, and just kind of trying to see things that I find interesting. And for me, it often happens to be these patterns and so forth, and symmetries. Sometimes this is not as symmetric as others, but still has some interesting patterns in it, triangles or others. But
Would you say that the triangle is your favorite shape?
I don't know. It looks like it,
It
but I'm
does
not
look
sure
like it.
if it I don't know if it with that style of architecture, yeah, it looks like certainly these leading lines that happens a lot.
Yeah, but
But
let's look
it
at all the
doesn't have,
triangles.
yeah, there are a few here too.
A few.
Mhm. That's true.
Oh, Daniel Sigg, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You've given us loads of your time, lots of
Yeah, of course.
insight into your process and area
Yeah,
of expertise. Um,
yeah, it's a pleasure.
I hope we might get a chance to speak to you again. And
Yeah,
I'm sure
sure.
my students will get such a lot from listening to what you say. And also, again, just to remind people, please do go and have a look at Daniel's website. There are links on there to the podcasts he's talking about, and also interviews he's doing with other photographers. All so much information, also wisdom, really enriching and nourishing for us as students of photography. So, Daniel Sigg, just remains for me to say again, thank you very much.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.